My son and his wife told me my frugal life was an embarrassment. They drove me out to a rundown motel, gave me $347 in cash, and left me for dead at 75. They thought they were abandoning a worthless old woman. They had no idea they were abandoning the sole heir to a multi-million-dollar crystal empire that was discovered the very next day. Before we begin, I want to say thank you for being here with me tonight. If you believe that a person's worth is measured by the love they give, not the money they have, and that dignity is a crown that no one can take from you, then you have found your people. It does my old heart good to see you in the comments, so please, let me know where you're listening from. Now settle in and let me tell you the story of how I was left with nothing only to gain everything. My name is Agnes Gable, and for 75 years, my world has been rooted in the winding, hilly streets of Eureka Springs, Arkansas. I was born here, I worked for 38 years as the postmistress here, and I intended to draw my last breath here. My life was etched into the very Victorian architecture of this town, a life of quiet service, steady faith, and a deep, abiding love for my community. After my husband, Frank, passed on 5 years ago, my world became smaller, quieter, but no less rich. It was contained within the walls of our small, lavender-painted Victorian cottage, a house we had bought as a wreck and lovingly restored with our own 4 hands. The mortgage was paid, my postmistress pension was modest but sufficient, and my garden produced the sweetest tomatoes in the county. It was a simple life, a frugal life, but it was a life of profound, unshakable peace. This peace, however, was a constant source of irritation for my daughter-in-law, Brenda. Brenda was a real estate agent, a woman who peddled the charming, rustic lifestyle of the Ozarks to out-of-towners while desperately craving the sleek, new-money glamour of a city like Dallas or Atlanta. She was married to my son, Robert, a good man with a gentle heart but a spine made of jelly. At 52, Robert was the regional manager for a big-box home improvement store, a job that paid the bills but left him in a perpetual state of stress, always feeling like he was falling short of the life Brenda felt they deserved. And I, in my simple, paid-for cottage with my handmade dresses and my frugal habits, was, in Brenda's eyes, the living embodiment of their failure. She saw my contentment not as a virtue but as a lack of ambition, a stain on the image of success she was trying to project. Her humiliations were rarely direct attacks. They were small, sharp paper cuts, designed to bleed my confidence slowly. When I'd wear a dress I had sewn myself to a family dinner, she would look it over with a tight smile and say, "Oh, Agnes, that's so resourceful." When I'd bring a jar of my canned tomatoes as a gift, she would thank me with a sigh and murmur, "We're trying to cut back on carbs, but thank you." She spoke of my beloved cottage, a home filled with the warmth of memories as if it were a hovel. "I can't possibly bring serious clients here, Robert," I once overheard her hiss at my son. "It's so cluttered and dated. It screams poverty." Robert, my dear weak-willed Robert, would just stand by, his face a mask of uncomfortable silence. He loved me, I knew he did, but he was terrified of his wife's sharp tongue and even sharper ambition. He just wanted a quiet life, and he had long ago learned that a quiet life meant placating Brenda at all costs, even at the cost of his own mother's dignity. The greatest symbol of our family's perceived failure, in Brenda's eyes, was the inheritance Frank had left me. My Frank had been a state geologist, a quiet, thoughtful man with a lifelong love affair with the rocks and hills of the Ozarks. When he wasn't working, he was poring over geological maps or hiking deep into the hills. Over the decades, he had used what little spare money we had to buy up dozens of small, seemingly worthless parcels of land. They were rocky, undeveloped, and inaccessible, good for nothing but, as he used to joke, holding the world together. To me, they were just Frank's rock farms, a sentimental, harmless hobby. After he died, the box of dusty deeds and maps sat in a corner of the attic, a testament to a quiet man's strange passion. To Brenda, that box was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Gable family. "Can you imagine?" she once said to Robert, her voice dripping with scorn after I had refused her offer to unload those useless lots for a pittance. His one big investment, and it's a bunch of worthless, snake-infested rocks. If he had just bought a condo in Branson, we could have had a real asset. But no. Rocks. She saw the deeds as junk. I saw them as the last tangible piece of my husband's heart. I would never sell them. This refusal was a constant source of tension, another black mark against my name in her ledger of my failings. I tried to ignore her slights. I tried to focus on the love I had for my son. I invited them for Sunday dinners, which they attended with an air of strained obligation. I knitted sweaters for them, which were accepted with polite, insincere smiles and never worn. I was the stubborn, embarrassing old root from which Robert had sprung, a root Brenda was determined to sever so her husband could finally grow into the successful modern man she wanted him to be. I lived in my peaceful world of gardening, church and community, pretending not to see the storm clouds gathering. I told myself that this was just Brenda's way, that my son's love was a silent, steady thing beneath the surface of his weakness. I believed that my presence, my history, my home still meant something to him. I held on to that belief with the same quiet tenacity that I held on to Frank's box of deeds. I had no idea that both were about to be subjected to a valuation I could never have imagined. One would be deemed worthless and the other priceless. And the person making that judgment would be the last one I ever expected. The campaign to erase me from my own life began in earnest in the spring. It was a season of vibrant, hopeful life in my garden, but inside my home, a cold, creeping winter was setting in. Brenda's passive-aggressive comments morphed into a more focused, strategic assault. My presence was no longer just an embarrassment, it was an obstacle. Her real estate career was struggling, and she had fixated on my cottage as the solution. It was, she argued to Robert in conversations I was not meant to overhear, a prime piece of historic property that could be flipped for a huge profit. My living in it was, therefore, actively costing them money. The fact that it was my home, paid for with my and my husband's life savings, was an inconvenient detail she chose to ignore. She doesn't need all this space, I heard her argue one night, her voice a sharp, insistent drill. It's selfish, really, for one old woman to be rattling around in a 3-bedroom house when we're struggling to make ends meet. It's her home, Brenda, Robert had mumbled, his voice weak. It's a wasted asset, Robert, she'd snapped back. And don't even get me started on her needs. The doctor's appointments, the prescription refills. It's a constant drain. We're supposed to be building our future, not funding her retirement. The words were a physical blow. I lived on a modest but fixed income. I paid my own bills. My needs were minimal. But in Brenda's narrative, I had been recast as a dependent, a financial anchor dragging them to the bottom. The final act of humiliation was not a spontaneous argument, but a carefully staged intervention. They sat me down on my own floral sofa, the one Frank and I had bought together at an estate sale. They sat across from me in 2 hard-backed dining chairs they had dragged into the living room, creating a confrontational, interrogator-like setup. Brenda began, her face a mask of cloying, false sympathy. "Agnes," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Robert and I have some wonderful news. We have to share it with you." I looked at my son. He was staring at his hands, his face pale and miserable. He wouldn't look at me. "Robert has been offered a once-in-a-lifetime job opportunity," Brenda continued, the lie rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. "A huge promotion. But it's in Dallas. We have to move. And soon." I knew it was a lie. Robert loved his job, his predictable routine. He hated the idea of moving. This was all Brenda. But I played along, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. "Oh," I said quietly. "Dallas. That's a long way away." "It is," Brenda said, her voice taking on a graver tone. "And that's what we need to talk to you about. We've been so worried about you, Agnes. About what will happen to you when we're gone." This was the most insulting part of all, the pretense of concern. The idea that this act of cruelty was, in fact, an act of love. "We looked at everything," she went on, her performance in full swing. "We looked at the cost of living and we can't afford to take you with us or to support you from a distance on top of all our new expenses. It breaks our hearts, but it's just not financially possible." She was laying the blame at my feet. My existence was the financial burden that made their new, wonderful life impossible. "So," she said, her voice brightening with a grotesque cheerfulness, "we found the perfect solution for you. A wonderful place where you'll be safe and cared for and have lots of friends your own age." She reached into her oversized purse and pulled out a flimsy, printed-out flyer. It was for a place called Oakwood Senior Apartments, a state-run facility 2 towns over. The picture showed a grim, concrete building that looked more like a prison than a home. "We'll drive you there ourselves," Brenda said. "We'll get you all settled in before we leave. It will be a new adventure for you, I finally turned to my son, my voice barely a whisper. Robert, is this what you want? He finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with a pathetic, self-pitying guilt. Mom, he mumbled, his voice cracking. It's for the best. We can't do this anymore. We can't keep struggling like this. This is our one chance to get ahead. His words confirmed the terrible truth. He was choosing her, their imaginary future, over me. He was willing to dispose of his own mother, to cast her aside into a state-run facility, for a chance at a life his wife had convinced him he deserved. The humiliation was absolute. It wasn't just that they were getting rid of me. It was the way they were doing it, dressing up their cruelty as kindness, their selfishness as necessity. They were not just abandoning me, they were trying to make me thank them for it. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. A strange, cold calm settled over me. I looked at the two of them, at Brenda's triumphant, predatory smile and my son's weak, miserable face. I had given my life to that boy. I had loved him, supported him, believed in him. And this was my reward. To be told that my very existence was an inconvenience they could no longer afford. All right, I said, my voice quiet and steady, shocking them into silence. If that's what needs to be done. When do we leave? My acquiescence was the last thing they expected. They thought they would have a fight on their hands. Instead, I gave them nothing. I gave them the quiet, dignified agreement of a woman who had just realized she was in a room with two complete strangers. The fight was over. The heartbreak was complete. And a new, unfamiliar feeling was beginning to take root in the hollowed-out space where my love for my son used to be. The cold, patient, and utterly silent resolve of a woman with nothing left to lose. The day they came to take me away was a perfect Arkansas morning. The sky a crisp, cloudless blue. The beauty of it felt like a mockery. I had packed a single small suitcase just as they had instructed. Inside were a few changes of clothes, my Bible, and a small framed photograph of Frank. Everything else. My books, my sewing machine, my mother's china, the 40 years of memories packed into my little cottage, was to be left behind. Brenda had promised they would deal with it after I was gone, a phrase that sent a chill down my spine. Robert was quiet during the drive, his hands gripping the steering wheel of his sensible sedan, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He didn't speak, his silence a heavy, suffocating blanket of guilt. Brenda, on the other hand, was chatty, her voice a high, brittle stream of chatter that filled the car with its falseness. She spoke of the wonderful activities I would enjoy at Oakwood, the new friends I would make. She was narrating a fantasy, a story designed to absolve them of the crime they were committing in real time. I said nothing. I simply watched the familiar landscape of Eureka Springs recede in the rearview mirror. I watched the winding, hilly streets I had walked my entire life, the historic buildings I knew by heart, the steeple of my AME Zion church where I had been baptized and where I had buried my husband. I was watching my own life disappear. After about an hour, Robert took an exit off the main highway. But we weren't heading towards the town where the Oakwood facility was supposed to be. We were heading down a desolate two-lane road, flanked by scrubby pine forests and dilapidated barns. Where are we going, Robert? I asked, my voice flat. It's a shortcut, Mom, he mumbled, not looking at me. Brenda fell silent for the first time, a nervous energy suddenly filling the car. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm. I knew with a sudden, sickening certainty that we were not going to Oakwood Senior Apartments. Another 20 minutes down that lonely road, we pulled into the gravel parking lot of a place that could only be described as a pit of despair. It was a motel, a single-story, U-shaped building of stained concrete blocks and peeling paint. The sign out front, flickering with a dying neon light even in the broad daylight, read, "The Starlight Motel." Half the letters were burnt out. A few rusty, broken-down cars were scattered in the lot. It was a place for transients, for people on the run, for those who had fallen through the cracks of the world. Robert turned off the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the pine trees. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice still quiet, my body numb. Brenda finally spoke, her voice losing its cheerful, syrupy quality, replaced by a cold, hard finality. "Agnes," she said, not even bothering to look at me. "Things are much worse than we let on. We can't afford the deposit for Oakwood. This is the best we can do for now." For now. I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Robert got out of the car and opened the trunk, pulling out my single suitcase. He walked to one of the motel room doors, fumbling with a key. Brenda got out and stood by the car, her arms crossed, her face a mask of impatience. She was already gone, her mind in her imaginary new life in Dallas. Finally, Robert turned to me. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. "Mom," he said, his voice so low I could barely hear it. "You have to get out." I moved as if in a dream. I got out of the car and walked on unsteady legs to the door of the motel room. The air smelled of dampness and decay. Robert pushed the door open, revealing a room that was even more grim than the outside. A lumpy bed with a stained brown bedspread, a single chair with ripped vinyl, a small buzzing television bolted to the wall. The window looked out onto a dumpster. Robert placed my suitcase on the floor. He wouldn't look at me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small crumpled wad of cash. He pushed it into my hand. "We're sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice choked with a guilt that did nothing to help me. We can't do this anymore. This is all we can spare." He turned and walked away without another word, without a hug, without a backward glance. He got into the car beside his wife. I stood in the doorway of that filthy, transient room, the crumpled bills clutched in my hand, and I watched the car pull out of the gravel lot, kicking up a cloud of dust. I watched it turn back onto the lonely highway and disappear. I stood there until the sound of the engine had completely faded, until the only sound was the wind and the frantic beating of my own heart. They had done it. They had stripped me of my home, my community, my history, my name. I was no longer Agnes Gable, the postmistress of Eureka Springs. I was an anonymous old woman, abandoned in a motel room in the middle of nowhere. I walked into the room and closed the door. I sat down on the edge of the lumpy bed. I looked at the cash in my hand. I smoothed it out on the stained bedspread. 3 $100 bills. 2 20s. A 5. 2 1s. $347. That was the price they had put on my life. The final valuation of a mother's love. In that moment, in that desolate room, a despair so profound, so absolute, washed over me that I thought it might swallow me whole. I had nothing. I was nothing. They had won. They had erased me. It was the darkest moment of my 75 years, the absolute rock bottom of my existence. And as I sat there in the gathering gloom, I could not possibly have known that the sun was about to rise on my life in a way so brilliant, so spectacular, that it would burn their world to the ground. I don't know how long I sat on that lumpy motel bed, the smell of stale cigarettes and despair filling my lungs. Could have been hours. Time had lost its meaning. The world had shrunk to the 4 stained walls of that room. But as the sun began to set, casting long, gloomy shadows across the floor, a flicker of something ancient and stubborn stirred within me. It was the same resilience that had gotten my ancestors through slavery, that had gotten my parents through Jim Crow, that had gotten me through a lifetime of quiet struggles. It was the simple, profound refusal to be broken. I stood up. My legs were stiff, but they held me. I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror above the dingy dresser. I saw a tired, frightened old woman. But I also saw Agnes Gable. I saw the daughter of sharecroppers. I saw the widow of a good man. I saw the postmistress of Eureka Springs. They could leave me in a motel, but they could not take away who I was. My mind, which had been clouded with grief, began to clear. I was a practical woman. I needed a plan. The $347 in my hand was not a valuation. It was a resource. The first thing I needed to do was get out of that place. I would not spend a single night in the tomb they had chosen for me. I walked to the motel office, a small, grimy room where a bored-looking man sat behind a plexiglass barrier. I asked him about the local bus service. He grunted and pointed to a faded, handwritten schedule taped to the wall. There was a bus that stopped at a crossroads a mile down the highway. It ran once a day in the morning. It headed back towards Fayetteville, which was close enough to Eureka Springs to feel like home. I went back to my room, locked the door, and sat in the vinyl chair all night, my suitcase at my feet. I did not sleep. I watched the darkness outside my window and I prayed. I prayed for strength. I prayed for guidance. I did not pray for my son. The next morning, an hour before the bus was due, I walked out of that motel room and didn't look back. I walked the mile down the desolate highway, my small suitcase bumping against my leg. The sun was rising and the air was cool and clean. With every step I took away from that place, I felt a piece of my own strength returning. I bought a ticket at a small gas station at the crossroads and sat on a wooden bench to wait. The bus was late. As I sat there watching the cars speed by, a long black car, the kind I'd only ever seen in movies, pulled off the highway and into the gas station lot. It moved slowly as if searching for something. It stopped a few feet away from me. A man in a sharp dark suit got out of the back seat. He was holding a tablet computer. He looked around, his eyes scanning the few people waiting for the bus. His gaze landed on me. He hesitated for a moment, then walked towards me, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and hope. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice polite and professional. "I know this is a strange question, but are you by any chance Mrs. Agnes Gable?" I stared at him, my heart giving a sudden, fearful lurch. My first thought was that he was from the state, that Robert and Brenda had reported me as a missing, senile old woman. "Who's asking?" I said, my voice wary. The man smiled, a warm, reassuring smile. "My name is David Chen. I'm with the Axiom Corporation. We're a technology company. We've been trying to reach you. We went to your home in Eureka Springs, but your neighbors said you were away." "I am away," I said simply. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice lowering with a kind of quiet intensity. "We need to speak with you about some property you own. Property inherited from your late husband, Frank Gable." My mind went to the box of dusty deeds in my attic. Frank's Rock Farms. "What about it?" I asked. "It's just a bunch of worthless land." Mr. Chen's smile widened. He tapped on his tablet and turned it towards me. It showed a complex, colorful geological map of the Ozark region. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice full of a barely contained excitement. "For the past 6 months, my company has been conducting an extensive satellite and ground-penetrating radar survey of this entire region. We were searching for something very specific. A large, untapped deposit of high-grade quartz crystal. It's essential for manufacturing the next generation of semiconductors." He zoomed in on the map. A series of small, scattered plots of land lit up in a bright, pulsating red. I recognized the shapes. I had seen them on Frank's old, hand-drawn maps 100 times. "Your husband, Mrs. Gable, was either the luckiest man in the world, or he was an absolute genius," Mr. Chen continued, his voice full of awe. "Because these plots of land, the ones everyone else thought were worthless, are sitting directly on top of what our survey has confirmed to be the largest and purest deposit of silicon-grade quartz in North America. It's a geological jackpot." I stared at the screen, at the glowing red plots of land, and I couldn't breathe. My Frank. My quiet, unassuming Frank. He hadn't been collecting rocks. He had been assembling an empire. "Mrs. Gable," Mr. Chen said, his voice gentle now. "Axiom Corporation is prepared to offer you a sum for the exclusive mineral rights to these properties. We've been authorized to present you with our opening offer." He tapped the screen again. A number appeared. It was a long number. A number with a lot of zeros at the end. So many zeros that my mind couldn't quite process it. It was a number that didn't belong in the real world, certainly not in the world of a woman sitting on a dusty bench waiting for a bus. I looked from the number on the screen to Mr. Chen's kind, expectant face, to the long black car idling behind him. I thought of the $347 in my purse. I thought of the filthy motel room I had just left. I thought of my son's face as he drove away. A sound escaped my lips. It started as a small, choked sob, but it quickly transformed into something else. It was a laugh. A deep, bubbling, incredulous laugh that came from the very depths of my soul. I laughed until tears streamed down my face. I laughed for the absurdity of it all. I laughed for my brilliant, wonderful Frank. And I laughed for the beautiful, poetic, and absolutely devastating justice that had just been delivered to me on a silver tablet at a dusty crossroads in the middle of nowhere. The richest woman in town. Me. Agnes Gable. The abandoned old woman. They had left me with nothing. And in doing so they had given me everything. The journey from the dusty bus stop to my new life was a blur. Mr. Chen and his associates were the epitome of professionalism and kindness. They escorted me from the bench where I had been waiting for a bus into the cool, leather-scented interior of their black car. They didn't ask why I was there. They simply treated me with the quiet, profound respect due to a woman who was about to become a major business partner. My first request was not to be taken to a fancy hotel or a bank, but to be driven home. To my cottage. As we pulled onto my quiet, tree-lined street in Eureka Springs, My heart ached with a love for it so fierce it was a physical pain. This was mine. The lavender paint, the slightly crooked porch swing, the riot of black-eyed Susans in my garden. This was the home they had tried to take from me. As I stepped out of the car, my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, peered out her window, her eyes wide with curiosity. I gave her a small, serene wave. The black car and the men in suits would be the talk of the neighborhood for weeks. Let them talk. The story was just beginning. Inside my house, the silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of loneliness, but the silence of power, of potential. I walked through the rooms, touching my familiar things, my books, my mother's china. They were no longer just objects. They were artifacts of a life I had successfully defended. I did not call my son. I did not call Brenda. The first 2 calls I made were the most important of my new life. The first was to a man named Marcus Thorne, a highly respected attorney in Little Rock, known for his sharp mind and his fierce advocacy. The second was to a black-owned financial advisory firm in Memphis that had been recommended by my pastor years ago. I knew with absolute clarity that my newfound wealth was a weapon, and I needed the best generals to help me wield it. Within 48 hours, my life was transformed. Mr. Thorne and my new financial advisor, a brilliant young woman named Danielle, flew into Eureka Springs and met me at my kitchen table. We signed documents. We established trusts. We created a corporate entity, Gable Geological Holdings, to manage the assets. I was no longer just Agnes Gable. I was the chairwoman of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. The news of the Axiom Corporation deal was impossible to contain in a town the size of Eureka Springs. The local paper, the Eureka Springs Times-Echo, ran a banner headline that shook the entire county. Retired postmistress sits on Crystal Empire. Agnes Gable becomes overnight millionaire. The article detailed the massive quartz deposit, my late husband's incredible foresight, and my sudden spectacular change in fortune. The phone call from Robert came the morning the paper hit the stands. His voice was a frantic, high-pitched squeak of pure panic. Mom, I saw the paper. Is it true? The land? Frank's land. Yes, Robert, I said, my voice calm and even. It's true. Oh my God, Mom, we made a mistake. A terrible mistake, he babbled, his words tumbling over each other. That job in Dallas, it fell through. It was a scam. We were coming back for you, I swear. We were so stressed, we didn't know what we were doing. The lies were so pathetic, so transparent, that I almost felt a flicker of pity for him. Almost. I have to go now, Robert, I said coolly. I have a meeting with my lawyers. I hung up the phone before he could reply. They drove back to Eureka Springs that same day, breaking every speed limit, I'm sure. They showed up on my doorstep, their faces a ghastly mixture of feigned remorse and raw, desperate greed. Brenda was actually crying, her mascara running down her cheeks in black rivulets. But they were not met by me. They were met by a calm, imposing man from Mr. Thorne's law firm, who informed them that all future communication was to go through him. The door to my life, the one they had so casually walked out of, was now closed and double-bolted. With my personal and financial security firmly in place, I turned my attention to my legacy. This money was not just for me. It was Frank's legacy. It was a gift. And I would use it to build, not to hoard. With the help of my new team, I established the Gable Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to honoring the memory of my husband and serving the community we both loved. The foundation's first project was announced a week later, and it was an act of pure, poetic justice. The Gable Foundation had purchased the derelict, run-down Starlight Motel on Highway 62. A press release, distributed to every news outlet in the state, announced our plan. The motel would be demolished. In its place, we would build a multi-million-dollar, state-of-the-art residential facility for vulnerable and displaced seniors in the region. It would be beautiful with gardens, a library, and on-site medical care. And it would be completely free to its residents. It would be called the Gable House. In the press release, I included a personal statement. It has always been my belief, I wrote, that our elders are the foundation of our community. They deserve to live out their years in comfort, safety, and dignity. The Gable House will be a sanctuary, a testament to our town's commitment that no one will ever be left behind or made to feel worthless in their later years. The story was explosive. I was lauded as a local hero, a saint. And everyone in our small interconnected community knew the story behind the story. They knew where my son and his wife had left me. My act of grace was their public crucifixion. But I wasn't finished. My second project was for my own people, my own community. The foundation announced a second massive donation, this one to my lifelong spiritual home, the Eureka Springs AME Zion Church. The funds would first be used to completely restore our beautiful historic church building. But the bulk of the donation would fund the construction of a brand new adjoining community center. It would be named the Frank Gable Community Center. It would house after-school tutoring programs for our children, a fully equipped computer lab to help bridge the digital divide for people of all ages, and a vibrant, daily activity program for seniors. It would be the new heart of our Black community, a place of growth, fellowship, and support, ensuring that Frank's legacy was not one of cold, hard crystal, but of warm, thriving community. They had tried to erase me. Instead, I was carving my family's name into the very heart of the town, not in cold stone, but in acts of love, grace, and power. With the foundations of my new life and legacy firmly in place, I turned my attention to something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a very long time: joy. Pure, unadulterated, personal joy. My revenge was not complete with their public humiliation. It would be complete with my own triumphant happiness. My third project was not for the community. It was for me and for the people who had truly loved me. I sat down with a high-end travel agent and planned the celebration of a lifetime. I booked a 2-week all-expenses-paid luxury cruise through the Caribbean. I reserved a block of the best suites on the ship. And then I sent out the invitations. They were beautiful cream-colored cards with gold lettering, announcing the Gable Family and Friends Celebration Cruise. But the family I invited was not Robert and Brenda. The invitations went to my cousin from Little Rock who had called me every week since Frank died. They went to my 2 nieces from St. Louis who sent me photos of their children. They went to my friends from my AME Zion Church choir, the women who had brought me casseroles and comfort in my darkest days of grief. They went to Sarah Henderson, my next-door neighbor who had always kept a watchful, caring eye on me. I invited 20 people in all. My true family, the people who had valued me when my net worth was nothing more than a paid-off cottage and a garden full of tomatoes. The news of the cruise spread through town like wildfire. It was a public declaration, a final, definitive line drawn in the sand. I was creating a new definition of my family, one based not on blood but on love and loyalty. The humiliation for Robert and Brenda was exquisite. They were not only cut off from the money, they were publicly cut off from the family itself. After weeks of their desperate, unanswered calls to my lawyer, I finally granted them a meeting. I did not want to see them, but I knew it was a necessary final act, the closing of a painful chapter. The meeting was held in the polished, mahogany-paneled conference room of Mr. Thorne's law firm in Little Rock. I sat at the head of the long table, flanked by my lawyer and my financial advisor, Danielle. I was no longer the frightened old woman from the motel room. I was the chairwoman of the board. They were shown into the room and the change in them was shocking. They looked diminished, haunted. Brenda's sharp, confident edges had been worn down to a dull, desperate plea. Robert looked like he had aged 10 years, his face a roadmap of shame and regret. They sat at the far end of the table. They begged. They pleaded. They cried. Robert spoke of his unbearable guilt, his terrible mistake. Brenda, in a stunning reversal, talked about how much she had always admired my strength and respected Frank's memory. The performance was nauseating. They talked about their future, how they had nothing, how they had been publicly ruined. They pleaded for their inheritance, for a share, for just enough to start over. I listened patiently, my face impassive, until they had exhausted their catalogue of excuses and pleas. A long, heavy silence filled the room. Finally I spoke. My voice was not angry. It was quiet, calm, and devoid of all emotion. "You talk about your future," I said. "On the day you drove me out of my home, you took mine. You decided my future was a single room in a filthy motel. You decided my life was over." I reached into my purse and took out my new leather-bound checkbook. I opened it, took out a pen, and wrote. The only sound in the room was the scratch of the pen on the paper. I tore the check out, folded it once, and slid it down the long, polished table towards them. Robert picked it up with a trembling hand. He unfolded it. His face went pale. Brenda leaned over to look, her eyes widening in disbelief. then narrowing in pure, impotent fury. The check was for $347. I believe, I said, my voice as cool and as clear as the quartz crystal that now bore my name, that this is what you felt a lifetime of love and care was valued at. I want you to have it. After all, it's all I can spare. I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Mr. Thorne will show you out. I walked out of that conference room and did not look back. I left them there with their check, their shame, and the ruins of the life they had chosen. 2 weeks later, I stood on the deck of a magnificent cruise ship, the warm Caribbean sun on my face and the salt spray in the air. I was surrounded by my family, my real family, their faces full of laughter and love. We raised our glasses of champagne and I made a toast. To my dear Frank, I said, my voice full of love, who always knew where the treasure was. I paused, then smiled, a real, deep and joyful smile. And to new adventures. As the ship sailed south towards turquoise waters and a future of my own making, I thought of the small cottage waiting for me back in Eureka Springs, the thriving community center that would bear my husband's name, and the sanctuary that would give dignity to so many. They had tried to abandon me. They had tried to reduce my life to a handful of cash in a desolate motel room. But they had failed. I was Agnes Gable. And my worth was not something they or anyone else ever had the power to decide.